Okay, well, thank you very much for doing this,
Yeah.
for speaking with us. So, yeah, we're basically, as you know, and we would have received the information from the Manitoba Heavy Construction Association. Do you have any questions about it or anything?
No, actually, I've enjoyed working with Manitoba Heavy over the past 4 years, especially about the infrastructure issue.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I'd like to ask you some questions about
Sure.
that, kind of, because we're speaking to all the candidates in Winnipeg and Brandon about what their plans are for infrastructure.
You know, we've got 3 candidates now in Brandon.
No, I didn't.
Yes, Mark Kovac is the 3rd candidate.
Really? No, I didn't hear that.
He has Turtle Crossing
Okay.
campground.
Okay. I did not know that.
Yeah, he's officially registered and everything, so
Okay. When was that in the paper?
I've lost track of time. Could have been Friday.
Oh, okay, I must have just missed it. Okay,
Yeah.
well, I'll have to track in now.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. So, I mean, there's obviously a number of different issues that, as a mayor and council, that you have to address. Where does infrastructure rank for you as a candidate now seeking re-election here in Brandon?
One of the critical issues that Brandon's facing is the fact that it's growing, and so all of that is underpinned by infrastructure. We've got 3 themes, if you will, in infrastructure that certainly I think as we move now into looking forward to the next 4 years that Brandon's got to move forward on. First one is, again, dealing just with the repair and maintenance of our existing infrastructure. And again, in 2010, after I became mayor, we asked Public Works to tally it up to find out, again, how much it would take to bring everything up to snuff. And it was $165 million, and again, well beyond the capacity of a community the size of Brandon to deal with. And so that's when the council got very serious about increasing our allocation towards our operating budget for potholes and sidewalks and curbs and drainage. So that piece of related to sort of the growth is critically important, because the next piece, of course, we've got is more growth. The new infrastructure we've got to put in. And again, when you're opening up the city as fast as we are, either south or north, again, we've got to ensure that we've got the water and the sewer and the roads and all of the core infrastructure in place. Our industrial park, which is one of the things we would want to leverage for economic development, is languishing, again, because it's unserviced land. And so time is money. When you're in business, you're not going to wait around for a city to get their act together to figure out about, again, getting that infrastructure in place. So we've got to make sure that that is ready for when business is ready. But because we're Brandon, Curtis, the last piece is probably the most critical piece, and that is extreme weather. Again, you know, the folks in Winnipeg and how they had to wrestle with frozen pipes because we had the coldest winter on record. Well, Brandon certainly had that same polar vortex come through town. So it's not just flooding, it's high winds, it's extreme rainfall, and again, unseasonably cold weather. And that impacts everything from the kind of asphalt and winter mix we use right to the size of culverts that we're going to need to put into some of those new developments that we're building. It also includes all of our flood protection infrastructure. And again, keeping this city safe and dry is paramount importance to council. And so again, dike work, what we're going to be doing with First Street, whether we raise it up and let the water flow underneath. Again, those are all many millions of dollars worth of conversation, again, that we'll be having with our other funding partners, the feds in the province.
Mm-hmm. Well, no, I mean, that's a good comprehensive list of everything. Is there a particular area that you would prioritize, I guess, when it comes to that infrastructure? Or
no, because each one is of a piece. Again, we've had a significant impact to residents because of poor drainage. Some decisions were made back in the day, and they put in an infrastructure and a storm drainage infrastructure that was pretty typical of the climate in the 70s because we were in that dry cycle, and now these poor folks are getting flooded. Every time it rains, they get water in their basement, their streets are flooded, and so we're having to go back now and replace a lot of that existing infrastructure, trying to adapt it for our new reality with a different climate. So again, from those day-to-day concerns about around people's kitchens, tables, we've got to deal with that. We can't move the city forward and increase our tax base and bring prosperity to Brandon until we get, again, some of the infrastructure for our new developments in place. There's nothing like a 350-year flood to remind you that you've got to make sure that that infrastructure is in place. And then again, there's just some real important projects that everyone in Western Manitoba understands, things like widening the 18th Street Bridge. We had an uncomfortable moment in the past flood this summer where 18th Street was our only way out of town. 110 was flooded, the underpass was flooded, First Street was flooded, and if we had had to evacuate the people that live on the flats, we would have been in serious trouble because, again, with 18th Street being the only street, it was very congested, especially around that bottleneck bridge. So again, that's certainly going to be a priority as well going forward. We almost had the province to the table, and then we had the flood again. And so now not only is it, again, changing and shifting priorities for the city of Brandon, but also our funding partners are having to realign their priorities as well because of the devastation that happened in Western Manitoba.
So the area that gets prioritized is the flood protection piece of it as opposed to the
widening. And again, no, because we're going to have to do it all at the same time. Mm-hmm. Because again, you can't build a city without an economy. You can't have the economy unless we have the infrastructure. And again, people should have an expectation on a day-to-day basis that their basements will not flood. Mm-hmm. And so we have very good folks here at the city, engineering and public works, and we've got a really solid set of projects lined up again for the next 4 years. It's just going to be a question now of budget priorities because previous councils have decided that they wanted to try and keep taxes as close to zero as possible. And again, this city council, while we've always kept it under inflation, we just can't keep it to zero because we've got to do the repair work. We've got to grow the city, and we've got to make sure that the city's safe and dry.
Well, yeah, on that, this is a pretty large to-do list, obviously. How do you intend to finance these improvements?
That's right.
What's the plan? What plan do you have over the next 4 years in order to do that?
And so again, looking at what we're doing with our operating budget, again, over the past 4 years, we've continued to squeeze other areas of the city so that we could, in fact, put additional monies towards, again, the ongoing repair and maintenance of our infrastructure. Mm-hmm. When we look at capital projects for new growth, we're going to have to bring the developers to the table. And again, certainly when you look at issues like flood protection, we have to have the province on side and the federal government. And frankly, when we look at some of the big bridge infrastructure projects, the province has to be there as a partner.
Mm-hmm. Well, can you elaborate on just what you said there about bringing developers to the table? Like what do you mean by that as far as financing some of this new infrastructure?
Well, in case your readers aren't familiar with how development works, every community has development charges, and those are the things that pay for the infrastructure, the core infrastructure like water and sewer to bring it to the development. The developer is then responsible for spreading it out through the subdivision, if you will. Yeah. As well, there's always a conversation that happens between the developer and the city to say, we would really like you to do a school reserve and maybe a bit of green space, and we need to think about, boulevards and those kinds of things. And so in Brandon, because of the size of the community, we once were These were always done on an arbitrary basis so that each developer came forward with their plan, and then engineering and city planning would sit down and arm wrestle over who was going to pay for what. Brandon's long past that now in terms of size. Other communities like Steinbach and Winkler and you know, are much more sophisticated in how they approach their growth, and again, Brandon has to catch up, because somebody's paying for those amenities and that growth, Curtis, and so it's either the property owner, the developer, or the residents of Brandon. And up until now, we have certainly been looking at the residents of Brandon and picking up that piece. And I don't think, frankly, that's what other communities are doing, some of them much smaller than us. And so we're going to have to, again, make sure that it's fair and that new growth is paid for by new growth. And again, we're putting a lot of effort. We've got a report coming to council to look at what it costs to open up a new subdivision in the city, regardless of who's paying for it, what the actual hard costs are. Garbage has to be picked up, those boulevards have to be mowed, the streets have to be plowed, the homeowners have to have police and fire services, and so there's a lot of amenities in the cost of those new developments. And again, so first of all, let's quantify that and have everyone agree, yep, that's the cost, and then we can sit down and do the negotiation of who's going to pay for what, because again, it's important that it's fair.
So there's not a specific kind of model or formula that you have in mind at this point, but
that's coming to council,
yeah.
And so again, we have been spending a year working on this, and very much looking at what other cities are doing. We don't need to invent the wheel. We've also been working very closely with Construction Association, developers, the Chamber of Commerce, other RMs around us, so that everybody really is moving along this process at the same pace. That, again, most developers live in the city and they understand exactly what we're talking about. And again, we'll make sure that everybody is in agreement as we move forward.
Are there any other alternatives that you would consider or look at in terms of ways, alternative financing methods that you might use to pay for infrastructure?
We're certainly constrained. We don't have some of the same funding options that the City of Winnipeg does because they have their own act. We're under the Municipal Act, and again, we have found the province to be very accommodating. Every time either something changes in the Winnipeg Act that gives them some opportunity, the province is quick to put it into the Municipal Act. But occasionally we, again, bump up against things like looking at tax levies, like Winnipeg uses downtown. We've got a few projects in our downtown that we've done, but they're just a little slower to happen because, again, we're working through a more cumbersome process. So, you know, I certainly am very aware of what communities in Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta are using. Down in the States, certainly local government has a lot of opportunities, things like the penny tax and those kinds of funding options, but they're just not available to us right now. So whenever I'm going talking with my other colleagues coast to coast, especially through Federation of Canadian Municipalities, I'm always keeping an ear to the ground about how people are funding their projects and their initiatives. We just announced our first Building Canada fund, for this next tranche of funding going forward with the federal government, and that's going to be very important. We utilize that fund a lot in the past 4 years, and certainly we will be aggressive as well.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I mean, and you touched on this throughout our conversation, but I mean, how if you're reelected, how would you in the next 4 years engage the federal and provincial government to invest in, to usually say the funding partners to invest in in Brandon's infrastructure?
I look at it on a couple of different fronts. One is that you have to make a business case. That again, when you look at the importance of the 18th Street Bridge to Brandon's commercial development and Western Manitoba's need for that commercial development in the city of Brandon. It's not just a Brandon issue, it's not just a convenience issue, that we need 4 lanes from one end of the city to the other. This is our Portage Avenue, and so we want to make sure that it's functioning well. So there's the business case piece, and that's the one that the bureaucrats default to. You also have to make a political case, because the decision makers are in fact politicians, much like myself, and they understand that this is a pivotal community when it comes to support for the federal and provincial government. So it's reminding of that in a pleasant manner. And then frankly, getting the community on side, because you've got to make sure that it's also a community priority. If everyone in town would rather we build a water slide rather than widen the 18th Street Bridge, then again, you have to listen to that groundswell as well. And so it's building the base of support amongst the residents of Brandon, and as we did with the airport, the residents of Western Manitoba, and then again layering on the added case for support.
In Winnipeg, some major infrastructure projects have been, I think of the Moray Bridge or Chief Bakewas Trail or some of those, they've been public-private partnerships. Is that something you would be open to?
I'm glad you mentioned that, actually. That Brandon, first of all, had the very first and one of the larger public-private partnerships where we did our industrial wastewater treatment plant when Hirst and Maple Leaf were at the table with the city to basically put together an $80 million water treatment plant. That opportunity going forward is going to be critically important. However, again, the federal government has a $100 million floor, and we don't do projects of that scope. The province has a $25 million floor, and frankly, we will do a few, but not many of that scope. And so we decided that we needed to have our own framework to enter into these partnerships. Again, we want to have a level playing field. We don't want to make arbitrary decisions about who we partner with. And so again, planning and the City of Brandon have been working very closely to develop our own version of 3P partnerships for projects that are under 25 million, which are most of our capital projects going forward. So not only is it an idea we want to pursue, but we're actually putting the framework into place to make sure it'll happen.
So which particular projects do you think that would apply to?
Well, again, when you look at some of the new growth projects going forward, we need to open the North Hill and what's known as the Black Farm. We've called it our North Gateway. Again, there's some really good opportunities there. But if you want to get beyond meat and potatoes, something like Soccer Park. That, again, a lot of private sector interest in doing indoor soccer. This is an area of interest that we've not been able to bring the province to the table on. And so again, if the community of Brandon wants it, frankly, we're going to have to build it ourselves.
Is there anything else, if you're reelected, that you would do in terms of being able to try to maximize the money that's currently spent within the city's infrastructure budget?
Well, I think it's important first to have that long-range plan. You need a story arc, especially because the projects are very, very expensive. And so that as we put our 10, 15, 20-year plan in place, we begin to then say, okay, how will we pay for it? When are we going to schedule it? We keep an eye on our own borrowing costs to make sure that, again, the city's going to be able to afford that method of funding. We look for other partners, again, who else would be interested in these projects. We look at our tax base. We look at what capital projects are coming off the rolls that we've paid for to give us capacity, again, to take on more borrowings. We, start phoning a couple of the more glamorous and exciting ones around, again, to our partners at the federal and provincial level to see if they'd be interested. And so, again, it really is making sure that not dealing with each project on an individual basis, but putting together the plan in place, a comprehensive plan. The last thing you want to do is pick an easy bit of low-hanging fruit and get everybody working on that, and then have something that is critical to, again, either leveraging economic development opportunities not be able to happen because you don't have those funding partners in place.
Mm-hmm. To what extent are you familiar with the Infrastructure Funding Council report that was done in 2011?
Certainly, I reviewed it extensively, especially because we were looking at my own personal learning curve. Infrastructure wasn't something I was as familiar with as other elements of city governance. Mm-hmm. Went off actually to a couple of very, very good national seminars dealing with municipal need for investment in infrastructure. Frankly, tapped into the expertise of Manitoba Heavy because they are leading the charge very much in Manitoba on this issue. Again, the City of Brandon's not the City of Winnipeg. We don't have the same kind of resources. We don't have, and those resources either being people or money or frankly governance, again through that Winnipeg Act. And so it was going through and reading the recommendations, thinking about, could this work in Brandon? What do we need to do to change it to work in Brandon? The priorities listed there are those Brandon's priorities. And again, some of them yes, but also some of them no. Because again, we're a community of 50,000 people that serves 180,000 people, and so we've got to make sure we're very responsive to those unique needs as well.
Well, which of those recommendations, do you think that you would be able to apply or be able to implement here in Brandon?
Well, I think when you look at, first of all, that really was the beginning of momentum for infrastructure discussion. And again, in 2010, we had a lot of conversation in Brandon during the election about affordable housing, and infrastructure really wasn't even on the radar. Mm-hmm. Again, having sat in that chair, I could see the tsunami that was coming at us, and so that was one of the very first documents that really looked at it from a comprehensive and strategic approach. So just the nature of the document, Curtis, really began to inform the way we were going to be dealing with the issue. The specifics of it, again, even if they don't apply to Brandon, I always right there to lend our weight for support, and I participated with my other colleagues around the province when we did the big announcement in Winnipeg when we were trying to convince the province to look at increasing funding for infrastructure. Again, it wasn't it was important that everyone speak with one voice on that issue. And again, I think that's one of the other huge benefits coming out of that report, is that it actually coalesced us to act cohesively. Again, when we look at some of our economic development infrastructure, which will be our industrial park, that's going to be important. Transportation infrastructure in terms of mass transit, not as big an issue in Brandon, certainly as it is in Winnipeg, and obviously, large cities like Toronto and places like that. Our issue is affordability here in the city, and so we're approaching that a little different way. So there aren't specific ones that we're not going to do or not support, but again, that report certainly galvanized us and really changed the direction of our thinking.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things in that report, and in other reports as well, like the one of the Canada West Foundation and others,
Mm-hmm.
they define, of course, core infrastructure being, you know, the roads and everything, and then also the social infrastructure
Right.
side of it, like the recreation facilities,
Right.
libraries, et cetera, and so on. Where would we talked a lot about core infrastructure in the course of our discussion, but what about
Yeah.
on the social infrastructure side? What would your priority be in terms of financing that over the next 4 years?
You know, and I think that that's critically important. I'm spending a lot of time over the next few weeks during the election talking about not just growth and prosperity, but community. Because there's no sense building a bigger city or a more prosperous city. You also have to build a city you want to live in, and that is certainly some of that social infrastructure. The challenge is the funding of it. And again, it's easy to make the case with the residents of Brandon that they need to put tax dollars towards water and sewer, making sure that the water is safe to drink and the roads are good to drive on. And so they understand that. The conversation always gets more diverse when you start talking about recreation and some of that social infrastructure. We just finished a green space master plan consultation, and people in the room certainly were united to say that green space was an important part of the community, and you only have to think of how devastated our riverbank has been through 2 bouts of flooding and how we've got to get that repaired. But the question is, when are we going to do it and who's going to pay for it and all of those kinds of issues. So I wouldn't say it's a lesser priority, and again, I've got some very specific announcements for later in the campaign to talk about specific projects here in Brandon that are going to be important for me. But I've also sat in that chair for 4 years, and I know if they're not important to the residents of Brandon or frankly to the council that'll be elected in that next term, then they just won't happen. And so again, that's part of democracy as well. So we'll see going forward. I think that we have a moral obligation to ensure that we have adequate infrastructure in the city. The other pieces, while not luxuries, because they do build our quality of life, healthy children, an engaged community, those things are equally important. However, it's more of a dilemma about, again, how can we afford it? What can we afford? And again, when are we going to pay for it?
Anything else you want to add? Anything else we can touch on?
I don't think so, except again to commend Manitoba Heavy for their leadership on this issue, and especially as councils will change again. Community leadership will change, and they need to have that voice to help them figure out, again, how to work through some very sophisticated, very complicated issues, again, like winter mix. Thank you.
Great, thank you.